Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining the webinar today. As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, my name is Jordan Smith. I'm with Utah State University, where I run the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. One of the biggest investments and opportunities for development that the Institute has faced over the past year and a half has really been standing up the Gateway and Natural Amenity Region Initiative. And we have really put a lot of effort into our webinar series. And many of you have probably started to get aware of us with our Zoomtown webinar series that we launched last fall. And now we're coming to a close on our How to Shred Gnarly Problems webinar series, which has also been just an outstanding hit. So we're hoping everybody can kind of learn something from these webinars, take something away, hear about what's working in Gateway communities across the West, take it back and share those lessons in their own communities. So as I mentioned, this is the How to Shred Gnarly Problems, Tools, Techniques, and Resources to Help Address Epic Housing Challenges. Today we're going to be hearing from George Ruther, who's the Housing Department Director in Vail, Colorado. So if you're not familiar with the Nara initiative, let me kind of provide you with a little bit of background. Nara stands for Gateway and Natural Amenity Region. And it's an extension program that is based out of the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism here at Utah State. The mission of the NAR initiative is to help Western Gateway and Natural Amenity regions and their communities, helping them to thrive and enhance the things that we all know makes them special. You can check out our website. Liz, who's our NAR coordinator, has just posted the NAR initiative website in the chat box. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the NAR website, go ahead and do so there. We provide on that website a whole bunch of tools and resources to address all the challenges that are facing in our communities across the West, with housing being just one of those. So I encourage you to check out the toolkit on that page. We also have links up there to all of our previous webinars if you're interested in looking at them. So if you haven't done so, we also encourage you to check out our mailing list and subscribe to that. That's where we post all of our information, share all of our information that is being created and curated on that toolkit page, where we have new webinars. When we announce them, you can hear about them directly if you want to go ahead and sign up for our mailing list. Liz has posted that link again, where you can just go ahead and sign up with your email address and your name, and then you'll kind of keep abreast of what's going on with the NAR initiative. So this webinar is the fifth and final substantive webinar in our How to Shred Gnarly Problems housing, or How to Shred Gnarly Problems webinar series focused on housing. You can watch all of the previous webinars from this series, as well as our previous series, on our YouTube page. Liz is going to share the link to those videos in the chat as well. So if you get a chance to look at those, or if you want to save that link right now, go ahead and take a look at those webinars. And if you find resources that are valuable to your communities or the communities that you work with, feel free to share them. As I mentioned, this is the last substantive webinar in our series. We will be holding one more that's scheduled for July 1st. And that is a peer-to-peer learning session for community members to talk with one another and really facilitate this peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge, information, and ideas, which is really what we're trying to cultivate with the NAR initiative. We'll realize that there's only so much that you can learn from hearing about, what's going on in other communities across the West through individual webinars. We really want to provide these opportunities for you as community members, as community leaders, to connect with one another and provide opportunities to have your voices heard, share what's working, what's not working in your communities, so other communities across the West can learn as well. So that last peer-to-peer session is going to be July 1st. It's again at 2 o'clock. All of our webinars are at 2 o'clock Mountain Time. If you're interested and haven't yet signed up for that session, we encourage you to do so. Liz has also put the chat for registration for that last webinar up in our chat box. I want to take a brief moment to mention our sponsors for this series who have made this webinar series possible. Particular thanks to the Wallace Stegner Center at the University of Utah and Granicus for their financial support. We're also receiving support from the American Planning Association's Utah chapter, who's providing AICP continuing education credits. So if you're interested or if you need those AICP continuing education credits, the link to them is in the chat as well. So go ahead and click on that or save that link for later, and you can go ahead and get those credits. So if you participated in any Nara initiatives webinars before, you know that they're kind of not the typical webinar. We really focus on trying to find ways to make them as interactive and as dynamic as possible. So it's not going to be an hour and a half of just getting a presentation. We really want you to have an opportunity to provide feedback. And we do that through the interactive chat function. So if you have the chat function open on Zoom, you can go ahead and share your ideas, share your responses. As George is talking today, feel free to send your content or your comments through the chat. If you have specific questions that you would like George to answer, you can do that through the Q&A button. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A button. And if you click on that, it should open up a new window that has an opportunity for you to type in your questions. If you do type in your questions there, I'll make sure that George sees them and he has a chance to respond to them either during or after his presentation today. So one thing that we do want you to do is make sure that everybody can see your comments when you do post them. So if you do open up your chat box right now, you should see that there's a little blue box that says who that message is going to. Make sure that it's that message is going to panelists and attendees. If it just goes to the panelists, we're the only ones who can see it. If it goes to the attendees, everybody else who's on the webinar will be able to see it at the same time. So make sure that it's toggled to panelists and all attendees. All right, we're going to ask a few questions during the webinar about the kind of going to tee up some content for George to talk about. So there's going to be some poll questions. We'll walk through those when we do get to them. All right, so to kind of get us familiar with this chat function and how we're going to set up today's webinar, if you'd just like to give us an idea of where you're coming from, what gateway and natural amenity region it is that you work with, that's a good way for us to get started and get a good handle or get a good understanding of everybody that's on the call today. So if you open up your chat box and type in your name and the gateway community that you're either connecting from or that you work with, and then hit enter, we'll kind of see where everybody on the call is connecting from. So go ahead and type your name and the gateway community that you're working with. We got Tahoe, Montana, Driggs, Colorado, Coeur d'Alene, Summit County here in Utah, and even some international representation there in British Columbia. So it's really great to see all this diverse representation that we have from all over the Western North America, really. So that's great to see. If you do have any questions during the webinar series, go ahead and type them in that Q&A box. Or if you have any questions for the NAR team or for Liz to answer about the technical aspects of the webinar, go ahead and type them in the chat. So with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to George Ruther, who's going to introduce himself and then get us started with a little poll question once he gets going. So as I mentioned, George is the Housing Department Director with Vail, Colorado. Today is really going to take a deep dive into their deed restriction program and how it's been kind of exemplary in kind of setting the standard for a lot of communities across the West. So George, again, it's a pleasure to have you on the call today. So thanks so much. The time is all yours.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Liz, and thank you to the NAR Initiative for inviting me to kind of share in this conversation today. I appreciate that, and thank you to everyone who's taken some time out of their afternoon to join us here as well. What you focus on determines what you miss, and I think that's an important piece. So I'll share it again. What you focus on determines what you miss. With that in mind, the Vail Town Council and the Vail Local Housing Authority sought to fundamentally adjust the focus with an eye on the value of homes for year-round residents in the town of Vail. In my opinion, the Housing Authority and our town council is to be commended for delivering on housing the way they committed to the citizenry and the community that they would do so. So in the town of Vail, for decades, housing has always been a challenge. And while we have failed to fully understand its value and importance to not only providing homes for our seasonal workforce, but also its importance in maintaining and sustaining community in Vail. So good afternoon. Again, I'm George Ruther, and I serve as the housing director here for the Vail community in Vail, Colorado. Prior to taking on the challenges of leading the efforts of the town's housing department, I was the town's community development director for more than 10 years, where I led a $2.5 billion private sector investment initiative and redevelopment effort that focused primarily on the resort side of our community. And I think that that's important to understand, because in a moment we'll talk a little bit about Vail's vision and where we see ourselves going in the future, where we want to be. And while the resort side is very important, so is the community side of resort community. In keeping with their commitment to housing, in 2018, the Vail Town Council approved the creation of the town's first ever housing department. The mission of our housing department is clear and concise, that we realize Vail's vision one deed restriction at a time. And while that's pretty simple in its nature, that really is the mission under which we focus each and every day here in the housing department, is that to realize Vail's vision for our part, we need to acquire deed restrictions in the town of Vail to provide homes for year-round residents in our seasonal workforce through those deed restrictions. Without homes for Vail's residents, year-round residents, Vail's vision to be the premier international mountain resort community will never be realized. And Vail, like so many of our communities, faces significant housing challenges. Housing remains the #1 most critical issue facing the resiliency and success of the Vail community. This most recent spike in the residential real estate market has pushed the median home price in Vail to more than $2.3 million. And in Vail, like I suspect is true in many of your communities, everyone has their own housing story to share. Some of those stories are about dreams come true, while other stories, I suspect, and unfortunately, are about nightmares folks would much rather forget than repeat. Today, I'm going to share a success story, however, the story of Vail's Housing 2027 strategic plan and the launching of our Vail InDEED deed restriction program. I'll talk about the value that the plan has added and its importance to delivering on housing in the Vail community. And then I'll walk through the Vail InDEED deed restriction program itself. I'll wrap up my remarks with some of the lessons that we've learned along the way, and then share some insights for you to maybe consider if something like a deed restriction purchase program is applicable in your communities and where you're coming from. I'll make sure that at the end of my remarks, we leave plenty of time for some questions and thoughts. So with that, let's get started. And Liz, I'm going to share my screen. So everyone has a copy of that. Delivering on housing. In 2027, the Vail Town Council and the Vail Local Housing Authority adopted the Vail Housing 2027 strategic plan. Well, what's important about this document, in my opinion, was it was a fundamental shift in the way the town of Vail thought about providing homes for residents here in our community. Up until this point, much of the conversation in Vail had focused from the earliest years on providing homes and focusing our housing efforts on our seasonal workforce only and almost exclusively and primarily. With the Vail Housing 2027 strategic plan, we focused in the conversation more on maintaining and sustaining community through the creation and support of resident housing in Vail. Underneath that umbrella, the way we administer the program and implement this plan, we achieve those same objectives, but again, we changed the conversation about why housing in the town of Vail was so important. The plan in its nature is very simple. There's a goal, there's a means, and a method, and I'm going to talk about those here for just a couple of moments. The goal is really pretty straightforward. In 2017, the town of Vail had about 688 deed-restricted properties within the community. The goal established by the strategic plan was to acquire 1,000 additional resident housing units, deed-restricted units, by the year 2027. So to achieve our goal by 2027, we need to have about 1,700 deed-restricted properties within the town of Vail and under the town's control. The means, and this is, I think, the important part. The means, a goal cannot be accomplished without the means for doing so. In this case, when we talk about means, I'm talking about the money. And the money that goes into this program is kind of an assemblage of funds that are put together from housing program funds that we collect through mitigation fees and development impact obligations and other sources of revenue for our house, specifically dedicated for our housing program, plus capital project funds that are appropriated annually by the town council. And housing funds plus capital project funds, we believe, create this notion of deed restrictions in the community. The method. This is, again, similar to the means. You can't achieve a goal without a method in mind. In our case, one of the things that we had identified was that part of the reason we weren't realizing the results we wanted to see when it came to housing in the community was our systems were set up perfectly aligned to get the results we were getting. And unfortunately, those aligned systems were results that were put in place and not delivering the housing we wanted. So we had to change the system. We had to change the process and the decision-making around how the town was going to go about achieving its housing goal. And in this case, the decision was made to change the decision-making structure to make it more singular in focus, proactive in its response, empowering, results-oriented, and nimble enough to be effective at achieving the housing goal. Up until this point, much of the decision-making process, and I suspect this is the same with many of your communities, lies with the policymakers, whether it's a board of county commissioners or potentially a city or town council. In our case, we had a local housing authority whose sole mission was to advocate for the provision of year-round residences for our year-round population here in Vail. In the instance of the decision-making process, we identified that our process was none of the things noted here on the slide. It wasn't singular and focused. It was far more reactive than it was proactive. It lacked empowerment and accountability. It talked about being results-oriented, but it really wasn't when you got down to it. And then it was very bureaucratic, rigid, and in its approach and its implementation. So with that notion in mind, I got the pleasure of one evening approaching our town council and sharing with them that, the purpose of this plan was to help, while we were formulating the plan, was to help us deliver on housing. And I got to share with our town council the unfortunate message that many of the reasons we weren't seeing the results we wanted to see with housing in our community was because of the town council themselves, and that we needed to change the method by which the decision-making structure was put in place, and we needed to place greater reliance upon the Vail Local Housing Authority because they did have the time, the ability, the expertise, and the resources available to change the decision-making structure. So here in the town of Vail is the problem, and let me walk you through kind of what this diagram is highlighting and pointing out. In the town of Vail, back from 2010 census data, back at that time, we had about 5,300 people living in the town of Vail. Those 5,300 people, year-round residents, lived in one of the 7,200 dwelling units that we have in our community. That's the homes at the top of the page. Those homes then are divided kind of down on the bottom portion of the diagram as either the 1,750 occupied homes, and by occupied homes, those are year-round residences where folks are living in a free market, non-deed restricted home, or they lived in one of the 688 deed restricted properties in our community. And if you've been to Vail, and hopefully some of you have been here, you'll understand and realize the community is built down in the bottom of a mountain valley. We are surrounded, our entire municipal boundary is surrounded by U.S. Forest Service property. And we may as well, as I like to share with folks, we may as well be an island out in the ocean. We have little to no opportunity to grow or expand our municipal boundaries outside of where it currently exists today. So when it came time to address this housing problem, one of the things we found was of those 1,750 occupied homes that we have here in the community, that 9.5 times out of 10, which is almost always 9.5 times out of 10, when one of those homes came available for sale on the market, it did not sell to another local resident in the community. Instead, it sold to a second homeowner or vacation property owner, and it fell into this pool of properties on the right-hand side of your screen, that 4,758 unoccupied homes. Those are the vacation homes in our community. So what we found was that, like many programs, we had the ability to build and add to our inventory, but the reality was the supply of homes that we had in our community, because of the land constraints, we needed to come up with a program, in a way, a means of addressing and protecting and preserving those homes. That's where the Vail InDEED program comes into play. And again, we like to when we talk about the Vail InDEED program, we talk about the Vail InDEED program not being your typical deed restriction program. And I think as I walk through these next couple of slides, that will become apparent is some of the differences with the Vail InDEED program to some of the other deed restriction programs that are out there and in place today. Liz, did you want to, at this point, Liz, did we want to share it'd be great to do a poll if we're able to do that, and kind of get an understanding of how many folks that are joining us here today in this Zoom webinar are familiar with a deed restriction and how it might be used in the in a housing program, and whether or not they're being used in their communities today.
Yeah, let me launch that right now.
That would be great. Yeah, if everybody that's joining us today could just take a moment and answer, these two questions that we have on here, because, what I'm about to share around our deed restriction program is fundamental to some of the successes that we have. So, fantastic. And then I suspect, Liz, in a little bit, we'll be able to tabulate some of the information and then share and talk about it.
Yeah, we're at about 80%. Maybe when we get a couple more folks, I'll end the poll and we'll share it.
Okay, fantastic.
So how about now? There we go.
Wow. So more than half, almost 70, 72, 75% are familiar with the concept of deed restrictions and how they're used to kind of protect and preserve or achieve housing goals in the community. Maybe later in the conversation, in the Q&A, I would love to kind of get some perspective from some of those folks who are unfamiliar with them, or in that question below, are familiar but have not implemented or are not using deed restrictions as a housing tool in their community, and kind of what maybe some of the other means and methods are that they're using to achieve that. That'd be fantastic to know more about. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate participating. So the next slide, the Vail InDEED program in specifically. The Vail InDEED program is really about purchasing, where the town goes out and actually acquires a deed restriction on an existing property that's located within the Vail community. In fact, I should say within the Vail region, because we have purchased some of these deed restrictions outside of the Vail community. But some of the numbers behind our Vail InDEED purchase program today is, and some of the specifics, is the Vail. I was talking earlier about the decision-making process. And one of the things I think that is so unique about our deed restriction purchase program is the town council, when I shared with them that they were part of the problem when it came to the decision-making structure, after I kind of peered back up over the podium to see if I was still going to have a job after that or not. But, they readily accepted that, and they understood that, maybe there was a better way. Maybe there was a better mousetrap for us to use to address this housing issue. And the Vail Town Council and the Vail Local Housing Authority launched what is now referred to a collaborative partnership referred to as Vail Home Partners. And the Vail Town Council granted agency to the Vail Local Housing Authority to act on the town council's behalf on a number of housing related issues. And that's pretty significant when you think about, those 7 folks were elected to represent the citizenry of the community. They somewhat advocated their responsibilities around this important housing issue to the Vail Local Housing Authority, not without, accountability and empowerment, but in responsibility, but they shared that responsibility through an agency to the Local Housing Authority and put the Housing Authority in charge of helping deliver on housing in the community. Those deed restrictions are then bought and negotiated for purchase by the Local Housing Authority using Town of Vail funds. And I'm going to talk here in a little bit about how we determine the value of the deed restriction. But I think what's important to share was we understood that very early on that unlike some of the other deed restriction terms that we have in place to kind of advance and promote our need for housing in the community, we needed a deed restriction with Vail InDEED that simply achieved the objectives we were intending to achieve. And that was simply protecting and preserving the existing supply of dwelling units in the town of Vail for year-round residents. So with that in mind, we simply created a deed restriction that has a resident-only occupancy requirement. And where that's important is we are indifferent with our program about who owns the property. We only care about who lives or resides inside of that property. We actually have some properties now in the town of Vail that participate in the Vail InDEED program that are owned by a family out of Mexico City. And they had a motivation and an interest to have some properties in the town of Vail for a long-term investment purpose and rental purpose, income purpose. And again, we were indifferent about who owned it. We only care about who resides in the property. And there's some terms that I'll speak to here in a moment about what that occupancy requirement is. There is no income limit on who can live in that property. We do have deed restrictions in the town that Vail that speak to, area median income and income limitations. With the Vail InDEED program, again, our objective was protecting and preserving the supply of homes that we had available. And because our housing problem is so significant along the spectrum, it extends from the most seasonal of seasonal workers in occupations here within the town to longtime professionals that have lived in our community, and everyone has a housing problem or a housing challenge, so no income limits. There's no price appreciation cap on the resale of that property. So when that property resells, we let the market determine what the rate of that sale is going to be. We do have other properties here in our housing programs that have deed restrictions on them where we place a cap on the resale value. In this case, we're letting the market control what the value of that deed restriction is going to be. There are no family size requirements, and simply said, when we negotiate the purchase price of a deed restriction, we rely upon fair market value, which is best described as willing seller, willing buyer. And this kind of takes me back, and I think an important piece of our deed restriction purchase program was when we were talking with our town council about this program and putting the program together. One of the questions that came right to the top of the list was, well, how are we going to determine the price that the town will pay for a deed restriction? How are we going to determine the value? And like all good government, we said, it's got to be simple. It must be easy. There must be a formula out there that says A plus B equals C, and therefore we'll apply that formula equally to every deed restriction purchase we make, and we'll achieve the results we wanted to achieve. But I think everyone would understand or agree that that's really not how residential property is bought, sold, and traded. And in this case, a deed restriction, while we're not owning the structure, but just owning a deed restriction or a covenant on the structure, limiting its residency, those properties, the value is determined by comparable sales for residential real estate. So we said we need a similar process to determine the value of a deed restriction. So each deed restriction that the town of Vail has acquired, each one of those deed restrictions, just like any other residential property, is negotiated on a case-by-case basis. And we did know early on that unlike residential property in our communities where there's likely a multiple list serving or service that exists around the sale of residential property, we didn't have anything for the deed restriction purchase program. So instead, we went out to the lending market, to the real estate market, to the appraisal market to determine and get a better understanding of what that fair market value of a deed restriction purchase would be. One of the things that we found out was, and this was, back in 2018, early 2019, that the discount on the value of the home, what we would be paying for, is about 15 to 20% of the fair market value of that home. Since that time, we have sold and purchased about 162 deed restrictions here in the town of Vail. Our buyers, or the folks who the town of Vail has been the buyers, our sellers of those deed restrictions have been home buyers. About 50% of the deed restrictions that we have purchased have come from home buyers, meaning people that are in the process of purchasing a home in the community and using that deed restriction money potentially as a down payment to help fund their initial purchase. A good percentage of our deed restriction purchases have also come from long-term investors, people who had long-term rental properties in the community. And I think what I like best about some of these folks are, again, we're indifferent about who owns the deed restriction. We're only interested in who occupies that residence. But a number of these long-term investors that we have been able to acquire deed restrictions or purchase deed restrictions from are people that otherwise at one point in time had their properties into short-term rental. And the short-term rental, as I think many folks know, it has had its own impacts and effects on housing in our communities. A good percentage of our sellers have also been homeowners, meaning people who already own a home in the town of Vail. They're one of those 1,750 free market units in the community, and they have chosen or decided to sell the town a deed restriction on their property for a wide range of reasons in doing so. And then lastly, and this is one that I think plagued Vail for many years. For many years, we referred to our housing problem as kind of a seasonal workforce problem or an employee housing problem. And it immediately created this notion that if it's employee housing, then it's the employers that should be responsible for providing the housing, and therefore the community members or citizens in the community outside of the business owners should not be concerned about this issue. And we struggled for years to try to come up with a way to more actively engage our business community in participating in helping us address the housing challenges. And the Vail InDEED program is one way that we did it. Didn't fully appreciate it at the outset, I will admit, but we now understand that many of our business owners, this is a model that they're taking. They'll go out and they'll actually purchase a property or help their employees purchase property and use the Vail InDEED program as a way of funding that obligation. One last thing of significance I kind of want to share about the Vail InDEED program, and not to get too far into the weeds, but I do want to touch upon it, is the deed restriction itself is a covenant placed on the title to the property. So that deed restriction runs with the chain of title from owner to owner of the property. Because of that, that deed restriction is perpetual in nature. And I know in some states, perpetual deed restrictions may not be allowed, but I think, I know in talking with some of the folks from the Tahoe region, I think they have come up with some creative ways of making those deed restrictions more long-lasting than what the legislature may have otherwise permitted. But in this case, our deed restrictions are perpetual in nature, and what I'd like to share with people is, perpetuity is a really, really long time. And because of that, the town of Vail needs to be in the first and prior position with our deed restrictions in that chain of title. That way, when the title does change hands over time, that deed restriction is always in the superior position in that chain of title. So as new lenders come and go, those lenders are not lending, they are lending, subject to the deed restriction that is on the property. And that's an important distinction, I think, that maybe we can talk about here in a few moments. Kind of Vail InDEED by the numbers, where are we at today? To date, since the launch of the program, we have done a total of 75 transactions, purchases. We've placed deed restrictions on about 162 homes here in the town of Vail. The total floor area of those homes, and that's an important consideration here in the town of Vail, but the total floor area that's been deed restricted is just over 130,000 square feet of floor area. Our total investment in deed restrictions to date is just over $11 million. And I think that's also an important distinction when we're talking about deed restrictions here in the town of Vail, in the Vail InDEED program, and purchasing and acquiring deed restrictions. We talk about them as being an investment in our community and not a spend. And it has made a significant change in perception about how these programs get funded and in support from the community members. The average cost on a per square foot basis, just under $82 per square foot. And then the average cost per deed restriction now is just less than $70,000 per deed restriction. And when we talk about, the cost of a deed restriction being about $83 a square foot, I'm not certain that what construction prices may be out in some of the communities and folks that are participating in this webinar today, but I can assure you that I cannot go out and build deed restricted housing for $83 a square foot. And some of our greatest value when it comes to acquiring deed restrictions is through the purchase in the Vail InDEED program. The last item of distinction I guess I want to share on this slide is, since the launch of the program with those 162 deed restriction purchases, we have acquired provided housing for more than 365 residents here in the town of Vail. In parentheses, you'll note I make a reference to a Timber Ridge development. Timber Ridge is a property that the town purchased back in the early 2000s. A for-rent apartment development that is here in the town of Vail. We purchased that property back, about a 30-year-old property. We purchased that in the early 2000s for just over $21 million. So for $21 million, we provided some older housing for some folks that clearly it serves a purpose and has a need, but it is also, in need of redevelopment. We purchased that property for $21 million and provided housing for 288 people. For $11 million, I have gone out and provided housing for more than 365 people and experienced none of the development risk or none of the development costs that are associated with new development. This next slide, kind of moving forward in some of the lessons learned in our adopting of the Vail InDEED program. I think many of the successes of the program and the Vail Housing 2027 strategic plan has been the clarity behind the mission, vision, and values. When we got very clear about what we wanted to do and how we wanted to go about doing it and why it was so important, some of the successes began to fall into place. We started with housing policies. Up to this point, we had some older, more outdated housing policies, and in 2018, the Town Council and the Housing Authority in partnership adopted 10 new housing policy statements for the Vail community. Number one, I'm not going to go through all of those, but those policy statements, but number one, and intentionally number one, is that housing is infrastructure. In a resort community like Vail, no different than roads, bridges, streets, schools, fire departments, libraries, utilities, etc. Without housing, we are not successful. It is infrastructure. And I think, as many of you know, when it comes time to funding within our communities, infrastructure tends to be higher to the list of funding priorities. So housing became infrastructure within the Vail community, and that's a concept, again, that I think really changed the conversation here in Vail. We were clear about our objectives, and then we focused on achieving those objectives. All too often, I found that some of the bureaucracy that we created was put in place, but wasn't necessarily focused on achieving our objectives. So if something about the program did not directly tie to achieving an objective, we cast it aside and said it wasn't needed. We just, again, wanted to be very clear about what it was we were doing and why we were doing it. As I shared a few moments ago or earlier on in my remarks, kudos to our town council and to our local housing authority for being bold, thinking differently, and willing to take risks. I've had a long career here at the town of Vail, but I'll never forget the evening that I took this idea of Vail InDEED very early on to the town council members and kind of shared just the concept, the 5-minute elevator speech about what it was and what we wanted to do. And one of our council members said, that's a great idea. It sounds brilliant, but what I need you to do is go out and tell me how they're doing these programs in other communities. And, very respectfully, I looked up and responded and shared, I can't do that because no one else is doing this type of a program. And kudos again to the town council and our local housing authority for being willing to take some risks, try something new, and not knowing what the end result was going to be, but also not being willing to accept, just the same old inclusionary zoning, commercial linkage, developer impact fees, residential linkage, regulatory tools that are used to address housing. Because, I do often share that Vail, we're no different than, Aspen, Park City, Jackson, Tahoe, Crested Butte, Breckenridge, where, we all have commercial linkage, inclusionary zoning, development impact fees, and we also all have a housing problem. So, our first notion was that we needed to come up with something that was fundamentally new and different. And when you do that as a decision maker, that's a big risk. I think, the Vail InDEED program is also unique in the sense that it is non-regulatory. All of those housing tools I just referenced and referred to, they're all regulatory tools. They're all reactionary. You think about commercial linkage or residential linkage, you only get housing when you get some other form of development. And rarely, in fact, I haven't found a community that has a 100% mitigation obligation when it comes to their linkage program. So by the very nature, it infers that every time you would get a new development in your community that generated new jobs, you were never going to fully meet the obligation for housing of those new jobs that were created. In fact, you were going to be going backwards. Vail InDEED is a non-regulatory tool that, again, is proactive in its approach, and it has nothing to do with other development activities that are happening in the town of Vail. I had an opportunity again to share this program with some other communities, and my one piece of advice that I would share was, prepare for success. We started out with this program not knowing, very confident about what it could potentially achieve, but I will be the first to admit, never realized we would achieve the type of results that we have achieved and prepare for success in doing so. There was a time when I believe we were doing more closings on deed restriction purchases than some of our busier real estate brokerage firms here in the town of Vail. And then lastly, I'll just say, I used to think about the Vail InDEED program, or want to share that the Vail InDEED program was NIMBY proof, and I'm not really sure that anything is NIMBY proof, but I do like to think about it as being NIMBY resistant. And my point being that, when you're purchasing deed restrictions on existing properties in your community, but for the fact that somebody is going to be living next door in that property and lights are going to be on, that there are no real impacts associated with purchasing a deed restriction on an existing home. That the house has already been built, the traffic impacts have already been realized, there is no construction that needs to occur, there's no development risk that you're exposed to because of buildings, no new home gets built on what otherwise would have been a vacant lot blocking somebody's views of something else. So, it's hard for people to argue that, having a deed restricted property in their neighborhood is a bad outcome. Lastly, funding is policy, and we talked about that. We are going through a process right now of identifying a consistent, stable, and predictable source of funding. Funds, like anywhere, are not limitless. We are going to likely go to our electorate in November seeking some additional funds for not only the Vail InDEED program, but other housing programs here in the town of Vail. Deed restrictions become a real estate asset, and I think that's an important distinction. We talked earlier about, this wasn't just a spend, but an investment. When talking with your policymakers and decision makers, make sure you're pointing out that a deed restriction has a value. It has a real estate asset value. Those deed restrictions now, it took a little bit of work, but those deed restrictions that the town now purchases show up on the town's balance sheet. And that's an important consideration when you're talking about expenditures and investments. Meet with your stakeholders. I literally spent thousands of dollars buying lunches and coffees and meetings and with folks, and anyone and anybody who would talk to me about, kind of this program and trying to work the bugs out before we ever launch the program. Getting your local lenders involved is going to be an important piece of the conversation. Getting participation from your real estate brokers. I've been in Vail long enough to know that there were times when some of our brokers, as going through the MLS, would identify a deed restricted property and encourage their buyers, local or otherwise, not to purchase that property because of the deed restriction. I now have brokers calling me regularly saying, hey, I've got a listing coming up. Would that listing be eligible for a Vail InDEED purchaser because that adds value back to the property? Or better yet, one of the first brokers that I spoke with about the program and participated called me back and said, this is a fantastic program. Don't tell any other brokers in our community about this because I don't want to have to compete with those folks. This is fantastic. We talked about there being no development risk. I shared the importance of what I believe is its cost effectiveness and efficiency, compared to new development. Not saying that there's not a place for new development, but, in Vail being the island that we are not going to build our way out of this housing problem. So we needed to come up with something that was far more innovative and creative than looking to build our way out of the problem. And then lastly, as I shared about the objectives, keep it simple. Every time we had an opportunity to simplify the program or look at our objectives, we almost always chose the path of simplicity, because at the end of the day, let's be honest, you want people to participate in this program. This is something that is proactive, that they're choosing to do, not reactive, that you're causing them to do. So keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my remarks and thank everyone for their participation. Liz, turn it back to you, and I'm happy to answer questions as there may be.
Thanks so much, George. This is Jordan. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of walk us through some of these questions. We've got quite a few in the Q&A. George, a couple on risk, and so maybe we'll start there. What were some of the risks that you took to get Vail InDEED off the ground? And then maybe we can get into some more of the specific questions.
Sure. You know, some of the risks, you know, just and I you know, when you look at it, you know, sometimes we get in our professions, we kind of get caught in a rut, and we look to, you know, as the one council member shared, you know, we look to other communities for examples, which is a great way of going about it. But you know, some of the risk we took in this case, Jordan, was you know, the willingness to go out on a limb and try something new, understanding that we didn't have a complete understanding of how successful it would be or not. You know, and every time you do that, you know, with risk, you know, comes reward, but also comes an opportunity for failure. But in our conversations with our decision makers, we talked about, you know, the importance of, you know, I'm fortunate to work for an organization that rewards failing forward. And, you know, we said this might be just one of those opportunities that we try something new, uniquely different, and we fail, but maybe on the other side comes something even better. But who knows? And then we also, you know, on the risk side, we tried to temper that, Jordan, with by saying when it came to the funding, you know, we asked for $500,000 in funding to launch the initial program, and the town council member said, you know, well, here's $500,000. Go out, do what you can do with this money, test it. You know, we'll kind of beta test this. We'll see how it works, and then come back to us. In depending upon your results, we'll kind of relook at things. Well, I was back to the town council in less than 2 months. I had spent all of the $500,000 on purchases, and they immediately granted another $1.5 million. And what we shared around the risk side was, hey, if we screw this up, then by all means, pull the rug back from underneath us, and, you know, and take the reins back. But we've got to try something uniquely different.
Thanks, George. That kind of really dovetails nicely to one of the questions that we have from Dan. All these are really focused on setting up the program. What is the source of the housing funds and capital project funds?
Sure. In the town of Vail, we have housing program funds, and the source of those funds come from development impact fees that are assessed on private development here in the town of Vail. So we collect a good sum of fees, not a substantial amount like I know some other communities do with their real estate transfer taxes and other taxing opportunities. But our capital project funds primarily come from sales tax, and you know, in the town of Vail, we live and die on sales tax as a resort community. So housing program funds and capital project dollars are the source of funding for Vail InDEED. We are, and as I shared, we are in the process right now of exploring some additional funding sources. Like many of you, you know, some of the folks I recognize from being on the call here, you know, you have taxes or fees on short-term rentals or other lodging taxes or real estate transfer taxes. We're looking at all sources of funding for the program.
Thanks, George. I want to jump to a question from Alyssa Bettinger, and George, you can maybe see these questions in the Q&A if I'm not getting them exactly right. But do potential buyers run into any issues with getting loans for these homes? And in the beginning of your program, how did you get any did you get any pushback from realtors or appraisers not knowing how much to value these properties when they sell?
You know, that's a great question, and I'll start with the first part of the question first about, you know, some of the challenges with securing mortgages or mortgage lending on these properties. You know, one of the first steps we took was when we developed the idea of the program and the concepts behind this program, we went out to our local lenders, and there's a handful here in the Vail Valley, and we kind of shared the idea with them and what it was we were, you know, choosing to do and wanting to do. And some of those lending institutions had engaged in lending on some other deed restricted properties in the town of Vail, albeit the restrictions were more stringent than what they are on the Vail InDEED. So they were familiar with the programs. Other lenders weren't so familiar with the program and you know, understandably kind of shied away when we talked about, you know, this was a restriction that was going to be placed on the title to the property. And oh yeah, we need to be in the first and prior position, meaning we need to be ahead of your deed of trust in the chain of title. Again, the reason being is in the event of, you know, financial distress or foreclosure, we wanted our deed restriction, our investment in that deed restriction to survive that foreclosure proceeding. So we spent a lot of time with our lenders, and I'll be very honest with you. When you do meet with your lenders, make sure you're talking with folks in those lending institutions that are on the business development side of the bank or the lending institution, and not the underwriting side. You know, nothing bad about the underwriters, but the underwriter's job is to go, you know, through a specific checklist and check the boxes. And if it complies, you check the box and keep going. If it doesn't, you leave it blank and the application gets denied. In the case of you know, business development folks, what we finally, you know, realized was, you know, they only make money. Banks, in this case, the lending institutions only make money when they make mortgages. So they're motivated to do so. And here was a program that had the potential of tapping into a greater source of mortgages within the community. So once we got to some of those folks, the conversation changed. And more importantly, once we got one of our lenders in the town of Vail to actually agree to lending on this program and signing off on some additional agreements that were required, it was simply a matter of picking up the phone and calling each one of their competitors and letting them know that, hey, you know, bank ABC over here just agreed to subordinate an existing deed of trust to the Vail InDEED program, and their comments were all the same. Oh, you know, that's great. Now we have to do the same thing, or else we're not going to have we're going to lose that market share here in town. So, you know, reaching out to the lenders early on is important in getting their buy-in. We also reached out to, I think the second part of the question was the real estate community and the appraisers. Again, an important consideration in that understanding, because they are going to be participating as partners in this program. We go around almost quarterly, or, you know, pre-pandemic, we have been going around quarterly meeting with, you know, the individual brokerage firms here in the community and meeting with the brokers and talking about the program, to the point where we now have brokers who are as well versed in this program as we are, and I call that success, because that means they're out there, you know, day to day selling the program to other people. So it takes time. It takes, you know, an investment of your time, but meeting with those folks and meeting with those stakeholders was an important piece of this program, and getting their buy-in was important.
Thanks, George. Alyssa, hopefully that answered your question. And also, you also kind of answered Eva's question as well. So hopefully we got that one answered. I'm going to jump to a little bit of a different angle here. And George, you set up this program really kind of, it sounds like, from scratch. We have a question from Karen Fink that really kind of wants to know almost a little bit of kind of post hoc analysis. Have you done any studies, or maybe even seen any similar studies, to quantify the value that a local home brings to the community as far as sales tax, to reduce job turnover, volunteer hours, any of these kind of indirect benefits, in order to make your case to decision makers and voters for funding a program like this? And if you haven't done so specifically, have you found other communities that have good examples?
Right, you know, absolutely. And in fact, you know, I talked earlier about, you know, the town purchasing that Timber Ridge property for $21 million, and not to go too deep into the details, there was obviously some financial challenges with that. And, you know, we went out, and I think Breckenridge, Colorado has done something similar. We went out and we commissioned a economic values and community benefits report of the town's investment into deed restricted properties, residences in our community, because we always believed that if housing was going to be infrastructure, which we believe it is. Well, if it was infrastructure, it had value, and some of the value was economic, quantifiable, very, very readily quantifiable by, return on investment. And other value was going to be, community benefits, having the lights on in the community, having people to run it for boards and commissions and volunteer in your town. So we went out and commissioned that study, and Jordan, I'll share a copy of that or send you a copy of the study that we put together. But for us, it was a game changer because not everyone, values the importance of housing for some of the just intrinsic value that housing has around human well-being and quality of life. Some people are just, at the end of the day, they're numbers people. And when we were able to demonstrate that we could produce about a 5% return on investment back to the community through, sales tax collection and property taxes and businesses, shopping at local businesses within the community, employee recruitment and retention, et cetera, reduced vehicle miles traveled. Parking's a big issue here in the town of Vail, and the more people that we can have working closer to their jobs, the better it is environmentally as well as economically, in doing so. So we quantified that information. And Jordan, I'll share a copy of that report with you if you would be so kind as to maybe share it with the folks who are joining us today. Because I think, like I said, that changed our conversation for a lot of people.
Yeah, that would be great, George. We'll go ahead and get a copy of your slides shared with everyone, and also a copy of that report once we get it. Another question, this comes from another attendee. Do you know what the average sales price of the homes you deed restricted was? And were most of them condos and multifamily units? What was the kind of the composition of the houses that have been deed restricted?
Sure. Right. This last 8 or 10 months has definitely, put a wrinkle in things and changed the makeup of the program a little bit. But, by and large, we were early on, we were questioned about the motivations of the program in our 1,000 unit deed restriction goal. And the thinking was, well, the cheapest and easiest way to get to the goal is by nothing but the least expensive units in your community, which in our case are going to be one bedroom, apartments or condos and studios. What we have found through the Vail InDEED program is that it's anything but that. We have purchased everything from apartments, that studio and 1 bedroom apartment, up to 5 bedroom single family homes and duplexes in the community. What's interesting in this makeup too is, I talked earlier about the business owners in their participation in the program. When I get a business owner to purchase or sell the town of Vail a deed restriction, it is usually on a 3 or 4 bedroom home. And what they're looking to do is, maximize their occupancy of that home. So they'll put, that home with 3 or 4 people, 1 per bedroom type of situation, and maximize their value. But we have seen, like I said, everything from condos to townhomes to duplexes and single family residences participating in the program. Our average price, kind of pre-pandemic, was kind of bouncing around in that $600,000 to $700,000. It's creeping up towards that $700,000, price range. But I think the most expensive property we put a deed restriction on was just over $1 million.
Thanks, George. I know there's some interest in the 100% verification process. I'm going to jump to that question, but I think we have a great segue to the next question from Madeline. And George, you mentioned the different kind of housing, the stock of housing or the types of housing that is restricted. Can you talk about how this program, the Vail InDEED program, connects to any other affordable housing initiatives that the city might have under its works, or how does this dovetail to other programs that the city might be working on?
Sure. Again, another great question. I think Vail InDEED, again, it's one of those tools in the toolbox. It's by no means the silver bullet. by any stretch, but it is another tool in the toolbox that we use to address our affordable housing challenges, here in the community. I think it dovetails well because it does, provide a program for home buyers, which there's not a lot of programs that are going to participate in that realm. It does provide opportunities, as I said, for business owners. We struggled for years, decades, working with this notion of affordable housing that I had alluded to. So it fits in kind of well there. It also being that it's non-regulatory. It's a proactive program that complements and goes with some of those more regulatory approaches that we use around commercial linkage and residential linkage. The other thing I think it does, and we never, again, first to admit, never saw this coming, but some of our larger employers, and this is something I would encourage you to also share in your communities, but some of our larger employers now are doing their internal version of a Vail InDEED program for their workforce. So by way of example, the Vail Health, our regional healthcare provider here in the town of Vail, employs 1,100 people in the community and region, and they have launched a similar program internally for their employees specifically. And like I said, I didn't see that niche ever coming, but there clearly was a need, and this program has spun off from the public sector into the private sector. So it's complemented many of the things we've done there as well, and it's gotten the employers, like I said, it's got the employers involved outside of any regulatory obligation.
That's great. Thanks, George. We do have a couple questions about how you do the 100% verification each year.
Yeah, that's that's a challenge, and that's a precaution that I think I would share with everyone. Is we do an annual 100% verification compliance process with our deed restrictions. In the housing department, there's two of us. There's myself and our Lynn Campbell, our housing coordinator, and what I've been sharing, kind of what keeps me awake at night is as the town has increased its supply of deed restrictions by more than 35% in the last 3 years, we've, that with that comes this obligation for annual compliance. We require compliance, like I said, on an annual basis, February 1st, turning in the documentation, supporting documentation that demonstrates that the person residing within that home meets the terms of the deed restriction. And again, there are several or many different deed restrictions, and we're doing compliance on all of those. But the supporting documentation is all then reviewed and verified for compliance. But we do a 100% check of all, at this point, 931 deed restrictions that we have in the town of Vail. And as the housing director, I share, we're only one failed program or failed opportunity from losing so much of the momentum that we have created, that the value of those deed restrictions is worth that kind of an investment. And it literally is hundreds and hundreds of hours of compliance verification, but it's worth that investment to go through that process. And we have taken that process, and I know some of the other folks on this call or webinar today have likely experienced this as well, to the point where we have had to have folks removed from deed restricted properties because of non-compliance. And while that's never any fun, it's worth, again, the time and the investment to do so, because these programs are so important. But I can share some additional information, Jordan, on our steps and our process that we have available online that might shed some light on it. But if I were doing this program in any community, the first thing I would share is while there may be some statistical significance to only doing 75 or 80% of the units, I think when you're making an $11 million investment in the community, you owe it to the taxpayer to ensure that they're getting every dollar of value that you said they were going to get with this deed restriction investment.
Thanks, George, and thanks for sticking through these questions. We only have one more, but this is a great testament to all the great engagement people are having with the program. Does having the deed restriction in a primary condition on the title have a downside for the local resident or other investor who is the other owner?
I guess I'm not quite sure. Is there a downside to being the primary owner and having a deed restriction on the property?
On the title?
If I'm understanding on the title, you know, it does, like I said, the deed restriction is in perpetuity, you know, so it doesn't just come off when somebody no longer wants it or no longer needs it or thinks it's important. It is a mutual covenant, you know, agreed to by the then property owner and the town of Vail. So, you know, I think there's a true permanency to these deed restrictions that are put in place. You know, some folks, and I've had an opportunity to share this, you know, some folks are like, well, you know, if I deed restrict my property, I limit who could occupy the property in the future. So that in and of itself has a discount on the value. So say I really want to buy a property in the town of Vail and short-term rent it. Well, a deed restricted property can't be purchased and short-term rented. So it has an impact, you know, in that regard. But, or I've also had, you know, people share, you know, if I do a deed restriction, it limits, again, the value on the resale of my home. And, you know, I don't want to do that. I want to buy this property for $500,000 and I want to sell it for, you know, $1 million 3 years later. Well, that doesn't always happen, right? And that's kind of speculating in the real estate market. And, you know, you don't have to look too far back in our past to see, you know, times when in some of these communities, real estate prices drop by 30, 40, 50%. And what I like to share is, you know, if in that regard, that's a speculative approach, but, you know, the housing challenge is always going to be here in the community, I believe. And, you know, if you want to speculate and you want to get out in the ocean and swim with the sharks, then by all means, you know, do so, and just hope you don't end up one day in a real estate market where you as the seller have to take cash to closing to sell that property. But if you want to participate and you want to have a roof over your head and you want to live in a great community like the town of Vail for all the reasons, you know, people want to come in and live in these mountain resort communities or in these gateway communities that we have, and, you know, raise your family and do those things, then, you know, sell me a deed restriction and jump in the pool and swim with me and the dolphins, and I'll give you a great community to live in.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up, George. I really do appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom and insight with us today. I'm sure there's probably a few lingering questions that are going to come up for George. We are going to record, well, we have recorded this session. We're going to make it available on the Institute's website. So everyone who has registered will get a link to that. If you know of somebody who couldn't make it or think somebody else could benefit, George's presentation will be available in the recorded version. We'll also have his slides as well as that study that George, you had mentioned. We'll also get that posted as well. So just a couple things to wrap up. We are having one more session as part of this webinar series. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and that's a peer-to-peer learning session. So it's not going to be a content-driven session where we provide you with a webinar or a lot of substance like we did today. It really is meant to be more organic, where we get communities talking to one another. Those sessions are really great. They're facilitated. This next one's going to be facilitated by Danya Amore, who is a Nara Initiative core team member. She's down at the University of Utah. So if you have an interest in that, like I mentioned, it's going to be July 1st, again at 2 o'clock. I think Liz has posted the registration link to that peer-to-peer learning session in the chat. So make sure that you check that out. So with that, George, I'll also make sure that we get any lingering questions or any questions that come to the NAR initiative to come to you. Liz, would you put up your email address? And if you do have any lingering questions about the webinar series as a whole, or questions you want to get directed to George specifically, we'll make sure that they get to him. So,
yeah,
Liz, I think you got that up in the chat. Any other questions, make sure that Liz gets them, and we'll make sure that they get handed to the right location. But George, thanks again. Great content today. I think that there's going to be a lot of value and a lot of interest in this recording down the road. So thanks again, George. We really do appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thank you for your time. And again, I am easily available here at the Town of Vail. You can look me up, and happy to answer any questions that that folks may have either now or in the future. Thank you again.
Thanks, George, and thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you soon.